Who wants to be the object of my embarrassment? Okay, that was great. Okay, so, no, here's the deal. If I was to call you a goody two-shoes, would that be a compliment?
No.
How many people would say it's not a compliment? Okay, you're all wrong. Okay, so.
I didn't raise my hand.
You're right, okay. Or you're neutral. It doesn't quite mean what we think it means. Here is the original, this is the source of it, which is quite interesting. Little Goody Two-Shoes is an anonymous children's story published in 1765. And the story popularized the phrase goody two-shoes as a describer of an excessively virtuous person or do-gooder. But it's not a negative, it was a positive. So here's the big part of the story. Goody Two-Shoes is a variation on the Cinderella story. The fable tells a goody two-shoes the nickname of a poor orphan girl named Marjorie Meanwell, who goes through life only with one shoe. When a rich gentleman gives her a complete pair, she is so happy that she tells everyone that she has two shoes. Later, Marjorie becomes a teacher and marries a rich widower. This serves as proof that her virtue has been rewarded and her wealth earned, a popular theme in children's literature of the era. It's just the opposite of what we've made it. Now, why am I talking about goody two-shoes? I was thinking about this as an idea for a message, but then when I found it, I decided to do a completely different message. Now, this term, this story, is an expression of our deep longing. We want a world that's fair. We want a world where the good guys win and the bad guys lose. We want virtue to be rewarded, and we want villainy to be punished. And this is the religious theme found in the last portion of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which is the central chapter of our Torah reading for this week. So in chapter 26, you have a description of consequences for following the Torah and not following the Torah. So what you have here is a list of blessings and then a list of curses. Blessings that emerge for Israel if it's obedient to God, and threats that will follow if Israel ignores the commandments. Let me give you a sample. It's big. I want to give you the one and the other. It says, the first part of it is, if you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, I will grant you rains in their season, so that the earth shall yield its produce and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, your vintage shall overtake the sowing. You shall eat your fill of bread and dwell securely in your land. Follow the laws, agriculture is going to work out. They're an agricultural society. There are more blessings, but then there are curses. But if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, if you reject my laws and spurn my rules, so that you do not observe all my commandments and you break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. I will wreak misery upon you, consumption and fever, which causes the eyes to pine and the body to languish. You shall sow your seed to no purpose, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you. You shall be routed by your enemies, and your foes shall dominate you, and you shall flee through, though none pursues. Now, those are the best curses that we have. It gets worse. The curses are so frightening that when the Torah is read in a traditional congregation, these curses are read, you're supposed to read it very slowly in a hushed voice. And trust me, you don't want to be called up for that honor. If you like your friends, don't call them up for that honor, okay? Now, this leads to a serious theological problem. In fact, it undermines a traditional idea of God. This religious dilemma is what I have with so many people who experience trauma, loss, illness, and death. So people will say, Rabbi, explain to me why things happen that are unfair. For the believer, the question is, how can a just, omnipotent, compassionate God cause or tolerate human suffering? How can God allow evil to take place? So last week, I mentioned that Rabbi Harold Kushner of Zichron Livracha, one of the great American rabbis, had passed away. And so I decided to use his most famous book as a commentary on our reading. So give me a chance. So Kushner writes in his book of his experience as a young rabbi. He confronting the unimaginable. There's a middle-aged couple who gets a phone call from the university infirmary where their daughter goes to school. And they say, we have some bad news for you. Your daughter collapsed while walking to a class this morning. It seemed a blood vessel burst in her brain. She died before we could do anything for her. We are terribly sorry. Unimaginable phone call. Stunned, the parents ask a neighbor to come to help them decide what to do next. And these people weren't affiliated with the congregation, but they notified the synagogue, and Rabbi Kushner went over, obviously, to see if he could help this family. So he enters their home, feeling very inadequate, not knowing any words that could ease the pain. No one does. He anticipated anger, shock, grief, but he did not expect to hear the first words that they said. You know, Rabbi, we did not fast last Yom Kippur. Just think about this. So Kushner asks, why did they say this? Why did they assume that they were somehow responsible for this tragedy? Who taught them to believe in a God who would strike down an attractive, gifted young woman without warning as a punishment for someone else's ritual infraction? It is our portion taken to its extreme conclusion. God punishes us, including for ritual infractions. So Kushner faces a dilemma like this and develops an alternate theology to our portion. Now, recently, Rabbi Jeff Salkin, a very creative colleague who, in fact, writes a regular column, he kind of frames what Kushner does with this dilemma. He says, to simplify, Rabbi Kushner notices that we can make three statements about the world, but we can keep any two of those statements in order to have a coherent worldview. We can't accept all three. The three ideas are, there is suffering and evil in the world. God is all-powerful, and God is good. Which two shall we keep? Now, most of us will not deny that there is suffering and evil in the world, so that statement, we have to keep that, unless you don't think that's the truth, and that is the truth. But what about the other two? If God is all-powerful and allows suffering and evil to flourish, then God must not be good, and therefore not a God any sane person would worship. And likewise, Rabbi Kushner rejected the idea that suffering is a punishment for sin, which had been a traditional Jewish idea. Therefore, if the choice is between a good God and an all-powerful God, Kushner keeps the good God and disregards the idea of an all-powerful God. I mean, I'll send this to you. It's just a really logical idea of, you got to decide, is God good or not? And how can a good God do allow or cause horrible things? So what happens to God's omnipotence? God is not omnipotent. God cannot alter reality. Why does evil exist? Well, there are two reasons for evil. First of all, there's human evil. God gave us free will. So when people ask, how do we explain the Holocaust? We explain it that people use their free will to do tremendous evil. And that God can't stop us from doing evil. And there's natural evil, illness, disaster. It exists because the world was created according to certain immutable natural laws which do not make exception for nice people. I always say, what keeps a plane up in the laws of aerodynamics? Who wants to believe that God can all of a sudden erase the laws of aerodynamics? Now, I want God's laws, the natural laws, to exist, and I don't want them to change at any time. So this idea of praying for a miracle, I don't want it. That means God can change the rules. I don't want God to change the rules. Now, these ideas are not new. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan and Harold Kushner talk about this. But most people assume that I'm a rabbi, and therefore I must accept that God can do anything. No, I don't. Now, here is why I feel that I'm a progressive Jew, a liberal Jew. I accept the Bible to be incredibly beautiful, inspiring, produced by genius. I believe that a serious Jew is free to challenge the Torah, and I cannot spend my life defending a version of God that makes no sense to me. I must reframe my understanding of God, and the entire rabbinical and philosophical tradition gives me license to do that, to try to understand, to challenge, to struggle with a text, if necessary, to even think my idea of God. Now, some will accuse me of distorting Judaism, of heresy. They accuse that of Harold Kushner. And my response is, if God gives us a brain to think, why don't we use our brain? How can our religion tell us, well, use your brain, but when it comes to difficult texts, don't use your brain? We either are told to use our brain or don't use our brain. It is necessary sometimes to reconstruct what the tradition says in order to make sense of it. And we don't do that in a cavalier manner. We do it because sometimes it's a necessity. I think defending the indefensible is not faith, but silliness. And there's no one way to understand God. Now, let me close, because he's more eloquent than I am. Page 134 of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, okay? Then I'm going to sit down. Or we're going to continue with the service. Page 134, and as I said, you can get this book for $1 on Amazon. There's like a zillion copies of it. This is what he wrote. He says, I believe in God, but I do not believe the same thing about him that I did years ago when I was growing up or when I was a theological student. I recognize God's limitations. God is limited in what God can do by the laws of nature and by the evolution of human nature and human moral freedom. I no longer hold God responsible for illness, accidents, and natural disasters because I realize I gain little and I lose so much when I blame God for those things. I can worship a God who hates suffering, but cannot eliminate it more easily than I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die for whatever exalted reason. And then I'm going to skip, and he says, God does not cause our misfortunes. Some are caused by bad luck, some are caused by bad people, and some are simply an inevitable consequence of our being human and being mortal, living in a world of inflexible natural laws. The painful things that happen to us are not punishments for our misbehavior, nor are they in any way part of some grand design on God's part. Because a tragedy is not God's will, we need not feel hurt or betrayed by God when tragedy strikes. We can turn to God for help in overcoming it, precisely because we can tell ourselves that God is as outraged by it as we are. Maybe we should get copies of this book and we should do readings from it. It is so profound. And there's one thing I want to end with, is that I know one thing, that God never had a better defender than Rabbi Harold Kushner. Shabbat Shalom.